is Bottomline Africa. Now, protesters continue demonstrations across the world against police brutality and racial discrimination. Let's now talk to Grace Jibril, who works in DC Area State Agency HR Department. Thank you very much, Grace, for making time for us. Now, talk to us about the current situation in Washington, DC. I mean, it has been a weekend of growing and evolving protests.
The epicenter of the protests appear to be centralized now in Washington, D.C., along with other areas in the United States. As opposed to more violent protests that were happening before, we're starting to see a calming down of the situation where groups are becoming much more structured, much more organized, and much more peaceful in their marching. In the D.C. area, the mayor actually drew, if anyone knows the Washington, D.C. area, they know that the road leading to the White House is 16th Street. So she essentially drew, as many of you have seen online, Black Lives Matter Plaza, making 16th Street Black Lives Matter Plaza. And it's a little bit of a dig to the current administration, but it speaks volumes in terms of what is happening right now. Now, the other more updated issue is Reverend Al Sharpton, along with Benjamin Crump, the attorney for George Floyd and the family, are organizing a August march on Washington. And from what I'm hearing here on the ground is that there's going to be a pretty large international coalition that'll be in Washington, D.C. marching.
All right. Now, George Floyd's death was just the trigger. Tell us about the history. How exactly did we get to this point?
When you're talking about the United States, you're talking about an economy that was essentially built on labor, essentially slave labor, free labor. That allowed the U.S., it's just fact, allowed the U.S. to grow, to develop really fast, much faster than its counterparts. And it started with 1619, where the first slave arrived at Fort Comfort, Virginia. Subsequently, after that, you're looking at 1775 to 1783, where the Revolutionary War occurred. During the Revolutionary War, blacks who were slaves fought, and they fought for their masters, and they were told they would be free. Did not happen after the war. We bring you down to 1863, where the Emancipation Proclamation happened under President Lincoln. That occurred. We're approaching Juneteenth. Juneteenth is unique in the African-American history calendar because it was the year 1864 when the African-Americans in Texas discovered that they were free. So, you know, just to give you that picture, fugitive slave laws occurred after that post-Emancipation Proclamation, whereby Southern states would go and grab their freed slaves from the Northern states and drag them back down. After that, there was Jim Crow. Between 1921 all the way through 1923, you have communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you had Black communities growing, developing, doing very well, that were essentially subject to racial attacks. And in fact, Tulsa is particularly what's known as Black Wall Street, and they were essentially bombed because the slaves in that community were accused of rioting when that was not the case at all. Another one was in 1923, Rosewood, Florida, a massacre. A massive number of blacks were hanged, slaved, and shot. Hanged, slayed, and shot, and as a result of racial discrimination. Now, between all of this, as you come up to this to history, you're looking at World War I, World War II. Again, African Americans fought valiantly, expected to get some sense of freedom, changes, segregation continues, rights were, racial bias continued, institutional racism continued. Civil Rights Act of 1964 came along, provided desegregation, institutional racism continued, socioeconomic disparities were there. The Voting Rights Act, which is 1960, I believe 65, allowing blacks to vote. Now, if we look at this thing, we're looking at 450 years of discrimination, racial bias, institutional racism, socioeconomic discrepancies happening. Now, when you bring it up to the fore in the 1990s and 80s, you see the war on drugs essentially guaranteeing that African Americans populate the prisons. That's what I call the school to prison pipeline. Racial biases are not just about the police. It is the fabric of the American society. And the battle you're seeing is similar to the battles of the 1960s, where people were protesting for equal rights, which led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What you're seeing is similar. Without the white counterparts here in the United States, there's no way that this issue of George Floyd or the issue of institutional racism could have come to the fore. So albeit there are issues between whites and blacks, but what is particularly amazing and wonderful about this United States is that you're finding everybody of every racial culture who is protesting, who thinks this is fundamentally wrong. It's the African Americans have a right to be human. What is similar to what's been happening with the police, and it's the militarization of the police which has really caused this issue. You're finding that between the drug war, where a person who had pure cocaine served maybe 5 years, if not 2 years or less, a person who had crack cocaine would serve 10, 15, sometimes even 30 years. So, and if you look at crack cocaine, which is a derivative of cocaine, it was prevalent in the poorer communities, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff, as we say, going on in the hood that people, of course, in Africa don't understand. There's this history I just outlined that folks don't understand, but you have to think of the psychosocial effect of this kind of thing to a people. You have to think about, you know, that kind of thing. Yes, ma'am.
As you have mentioned, it's been years of discrimination and suffering. As a woman of color, you are in the United States. What is your experience?
Yeah. It's been a little tough. It's extremely difficult when you walk into a work environment and you're speaking proper English. You see, you guys in Kenya taught me well, because I went to school in Hill School in Eldoret, and I had a wonderful English teacher named Mrs. Scott, and a bunch of other, Mr. Omondi, really great teachers. You know, we underestimate the power and the value of Kenyan teachers, because I am who I am because of Hill School. But then when I go into a work environment, of course, I've been in the U.S. since 1984, and come in and out of the country maybe once, or when I was small, I stayed long for 2 years, 87 and 88. Then, of course, since then I've been in the U.S., then back maybe 2 or 3 times. But what I found in the workplace is that people look at you strangely, like when you're speaking English, like proper English. It's almost like, well, wait a minute. And then after the wait a minute, it's, who do you think you are? You think you're an uppity black person. You need to understand that, you know, you may be black and educated, but I'm white. So these are the problems we face every day. We push them aside and we base everything we do on proof, merit, capacity, and education. And you have to be confident. That's one thing I want to tell young people who think about coming to the US. You need to be confident about being Kenyan. You need to step up and put your head up and not allow anybody to question your blackness, your culture, or who you are. Because at the end of the day, the benefits we enjoy in Kenya, which is a place I know, when you look at the life in the US, it doesn't compare. Yes, the US has great education. Yes, the dollar is powerful. But from a cultural perspective, a lot of times an educational perspective, if your parents don't have money, you're not in a city where schools are well funded, school to prison pipeline. You know, the teachers, depending on the one you have, if you're a black boy, statistics say that black boys are usually biased in the classroom. They're more likely to be suspended at standard 1 or grade 1. So there are things that are happening. Like I said, people don't know what's going on, I guess, in the hood. There's a lot of struggle that's been happening for many, many years. Contact with the police has been extremely sketchy. There are very good police officers out there. Wonderful. I live in a town where the residents are the police, and we have a wonderful police force here. But then there are places like Baltimore, there are places around the DC area, Southeast DC, where things are happening, and no one said anything. And it just blew up with George Floyd. It blew up with George Floyd. It bubbled up with Ahmaud Arbery, and it started simmering and creating itself when Breonna Taylor was killed in her bedroom in the middle of the night.
All right, I'm really sorry for your experience and what you have to go through just to survive because of your skin color. But we're seeing the protest being a step in the right direction. And when we go to Minneapolis, a majority of the city council announced its intent to dismantle the city's police department and invest in community-led public safety. Now, the mayor, Jacob Frey, however, was not of the same view. Is dismantling the city police department the right move?
It's good and it's bad. You want to really be careful about dismantling the police force. I can understand dismantling a police force and starting from scratch, but if you dismantle it, you're essentially dismantling the part of the community that implements the law. So you've got to be very careful doing that. What needs to happen is the President Obama essentially provided a steps process to, number one, demilitarize police, enhance engagement, and that has not been implemented by many, many states. And a lot of it has to do with partisanship. Dismantling or defunding a police force is really not good, because what you end up doing is throwing the baby with the bathwater. You have an institution of course, the blue wall, they call it, of corrupt police officers. But what you have to do is you have to try and empower the police officers that are doing good for the community. We need police officers in our lives. We just don't need them to be apartheid police, which is really what's been happening. When Black men, especially, do not have the capacity to have free movement within a community, no one is listening when we talk about things in the neighborhood, police officers setting them up, planting evidence. We've even heard of Chicago where pallets of guns are left in the streets. We don't know if that's factual or not, but so many people keep saying it. They find guns, gangs pick them up, the next thing you know is a massive gang war, and the bodies start piling up, and it's Black bodies. And on top of that, you couple that with lack of education, you couple that with institutional racism, you couple with so many socioeconomic issues and psychosocial issues that have occurred. You have a person who's just trying to manage, and in doing so, they oftentimes break the law. But the problem is, the way we handle the person who breaks the law needs to be based on the policies and procedures that you learned in the academy as a police officer. It cannot be first instinct. A guy, you go to arrest a guy and that's a death penalty, as is George Floyd, you know?
Yes.
So it's a lot of really, I'm fortunate. Of course, I'm just talking to you about my observations, but I'm one of the few lucky ones. I mean, I've done really well in the US. I've worked hard. I've grown my profession. And a lot of the people who started me out of my profession are white, you see? Mm-hmm. So you see the battle you fight constantly. You can't just say white folks are bad, and you can't say Black folks are criminal. And that's another thing we do as Africans. We look at Black Americans and we say, oh, these guys are lazy. And no, there's a story to it. And I've outlined historically what's happened. I have not even started with the in-betweens. So what we have to do as Africans in support of African Americans is engage more. Look at a lot of the blogs that are out there. Look at some of the information. Look up Tulsa, Oklahoma. Look up Rosewood, Florida. Look up the history, and you can become more educated.
All right, and as you mentioned before, it's all about policies, the policies that they have. Now, Democrats unveiled sweeping bill targeting police misconduct and racial bias just a few hours ago, if I'm not wrong. Now, it is a bill that proposes significant changes to the rules that govern how police officers operate and how they can be held accountable for wrongdoing. Many of these measures civil rights activists have been pushing for decades, which have been met with strong opposition from police unions and law enforcement groups. So this might take some time to enforce. So then what are some of the short-term solutions that we can even start implementing before we look at the long-term solutions?
I think engagement with community. Before I worked for the state, I worked for the Department of Labor's National Job Corps program, where we provided vocational skills training for young people between the ages of 16 to 24. These guys were coming into our site broken. They were coming into our site broken, and the one powerful supporter we had was the Washington, D.C. Police Department. They were present, they were engaging. We were a community organization. We worked with the community around Southeast D.C. to essentially ensure that kids who had dropped out of high school had a way or a path to a job, a path to a skill. And that's why even I always say to myself that the key to Africa's problem is engaging the youth. I keep saying it over and over. We have to engage the youth, provide vocational skills for those who are not educated, provide basic adult education in terms of reading capacity. With that, and there's systems that one can set into place. The U.S., I remember Kenya, the Kenyan delegation came to the National Job Corps program in Washington, D.C. in 2004 to look at the models we were doing, because we were taking kids who had gone to prison. Some were, low-level crimes, who would have continued with the habit of, crime. And they were coming in here, changing their lives and becoming electricians, carpenters. And what a lot of people don't know is electrical, carpeting, and air conditioning are some of the most highest paid jobs and attract to entrepreneurship. But what allowed us to be successful was engagement with the police in the community, getting our young people engaged. So within neighborhoods and homes, our success here in the city that I live in is the police. The police, we know them. We get along with them. They're our neighbors. We see their cars parked in the driveway. They're normal human beings to us. And in so doing, you humanize the people you serve. What I'm finding in a lot of these neighborhoods in Baltimore, Chicago, and Detroit is the police has forgotten that they're dealing with human beings, broken human beings. So a cultural competency course, like I do at my job in human resources, I talk about the Civil Rights Act, its application in the job environment. I talk about how cultural competency essentially prevents bias. If you understand where someone is from, and it's almost like we go through these phases in the U.S. because you find that after 9/11 there was this Islamophobia, you know? Then before that, you know, there were all these other issues, you know, the war on drugs. Then now we're dealing with this rise in racist sentiment. And then of course, 2 years ago, 2017, 2016, we were dogging the Hispanic population. We still have them in cages in the United States. So, you know, land of the free, home of the brave needs to be remembered at all times. Even I have a responsibility to watch my own biases about my fellow Americans. That's just, we're human. But acting on them is another thing altogether. Acting on them where you're a police officer is nothing short of being, you know, just creating an apartheid system where people just do not have free movement. It's unfortunate.
I think that's the best place to end it. And I think there's one thing that I'll take for you, that police have forgotten they deal with human beings. I think that's very powerful. Thank you very much, Grace Jibril, who works in the DC Area State Agency HR Department. Thank you very much for making time for us. Now, pottery, basket work, and wrought iron